Ambassador Dan Shapiro was truly an outstanding representative of the President of the United States. He served President Obama and the administration and the American people as our ambassador in Tel Aviv. He worked closely with the Netanyahu government. He worked an outreach to people from all walks of life, not only within Israel, but across the United States. We're so honored that Ambassador Shapiro is with us here today.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you, Herbert, and thanks to all the organizers of the American Zionist movement and this really important day and symposium here on Capitol Hill. And I love every word in the banner about renewing the commitment to bipartisanship in the U.S.-Israel relationship and support of Israel and Zionism. Those are fundamental words. They mean something, and they have particular resonance here on Capitol Hill, where I toiled for many years and where I know that work goes on with the current membership and staff in the Congress. I am in from Tel Aviv just very, very briefly, still living there. You know, it's good living, and it's a better winter than what you have here. And we've got kids who are in Israeli schools and really happy, so we're extending our time there. I encourage all of you to come visit, and we'll definitely make some time together. But I do want to just say a few words briefly about what I know is often a dialogue in our community and maybe in the broader political community around Israel that comes with it the label of how divided we are, how much we're arguing with each other, how much we're fighting with one another, how deep the divisions are. Some Jewish communities, I'm told, fortunately I've been able to visit many where this has not been the case, but they don't even want to have speakers come in on Israel, and rabbis don't want to speak about Israel or teach about Israel because it's a divisive issue. So I'm sure that exists to some degree. But I do think it is something to be resisted in forums like this, where people who do have different views on some of the issues around Israel and around the U.S.-Israel relationship can also come together and unite around some very important fundamental common principles. And when we do that, I think one of the things we discover is that we are actually less divided than we appear. And it's worth underscoring that as well, that there is a fundamental consensus in both parties and in the broad sweep of our community, and I'd say broadly in the United States, around certain key principles. I'll just mention them. Obviously, the importance of the U.S.-Israel partnership as a fulfillment of moral obligations to a great ally, to the Jewish people who, after centuries of exile, returned to their home and established the first sovereign Jewish state in nearly 2,000 years. And that is a place that has allowed Jews to be safe there and the Jewish people even all around the world to be safe. That's a moral commitment we make as the United States of America, but it's also something that fundamentally serves our strategic interests. To have a partner like that, a capable partner that fights its own battles but is oriented with us against the same matrix of threats in the Middle East, that's something that serves our moral values and serves our strategic interests. I don't think there's any disagreement about that. Those are fundamental principles that are unifying principles. Derivative of that, of course, is our obligation to Israel's security, to ensure that Israel always has the means to defend itself, the right and the legitimacy that is respected internationally to defend itself, and that those things are never called into question. And those are because of facts, because of the enemies that Israel faces and that the Israeli people have to raise their children surrounded by. Hezbollah in the north, armed with over 100,000 rockets and missiles, and now digging tunnels under the border. Hamas in the south and scattered in the West Bank as well, launching rockets into population centers, also digging tunnels, also conducting terrorist attacks in the West Bank. ISIS and other extremist organizations that have popped up in Syria during the Civil War, and also in the Sinai, and of course Iran, a regime that openly calls for Israel's destruction, that seeks nuclear weapons, that tests ballistic missiles, that engages all sorts of other regional mayhem. So whether it's proliferation of weapons of mass destruction or terror of all its different forms or instability on its various borders, Israel faces those fundamental strategic and security challenges, and we, as the United States, its ally, have an obligation to ensure that they have the means and they have the ability and legitimacy to tackle them. The administration I served, President Obama's administration, of course, was duly committed to those principles. I won't recite the long history, but of course, the Iron Dome system, which has saved so many lives with its over 1,000 interceptions of rockets, was initiated. The funding for it was initiated during those years. The F-35, now the new backbone of the Israeli Air Force for the next generation, was started during those years. The tunnel detection technology program, which is bearing fruit now as Israel is finding and destroying tunnels in the south and in the north. And of course, the $38 billion MOU that was signed in 2016. Those were all expressions of the commitment of the United States, and all of it had bipartisan support in Congress. For the U.S.-Israel relationship, and all of that continues in the Trump administration. Believe me, I've got many differences with the Trump administration, but none of them have anything to do with their support for Israel's security, with their now very forthright implementation of the MOU, which has now come into force at the beginning of this new fiscal year. Hopefully, Congress will soon be able to add its voice for a long-term authorization for that, and all of the joint training and intelligence operations, and now focus on things like tunnels and rockets and ensuring Israel's ability to act where it needs to. That continues under the Trump administration as it did under the Obama administration. And this is our history. Our history, you know, we just, of course, mourned the loss of President George H.W. Bush, but this is the Bush administration that rushed Patriot missiles to Israel to defend Israel during the first Gulf War when Saddam Hussein was launching Scud missiles at Israel. During the Clinton administration, when Israel faced waves of bus bombings from Hamas, and a new wave of counterterrorism assistance was provided, and then the first 10-year MOU on military assistance upgrading that was signed, and the George W. Bush administration, which also cooperated very much with Israel against terror, mostly Palestinian terror, and then facilitated through incredible U.S.-Israel cooperation Israel's ability to strike at a nuclear reactor that Syria was building, or the North Koreans were building for Syria. This is our history. That's the last quarter century. You can go back even further. Each administration has built on the achievements of the last, always with strong bipartisan support in Congress to ensure that that commitment to Israel's security actually has meaning and has substance. And we should view that as a point of unity, not in any way as a point that divides our community. And it extends down into specific security challenges that Israel faces. In Syria, which initially Israel was focused on trying to stay out of during this terrible civil war, then realizing it needed to strike at weapons shipments through Syria, which it did throughout the last 5 or 6 years with U.S. support and coordination at shipments from Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And then the threat began to change as Iran began to try to establish military positions and infrastructure in Syria itself to use to attack against Israel, and did attack Israel with a drone and with rockets against the Golan Heights. And ensuring Israel has the strategic, the freedom of operation and the legitimacy to conduct those operations it needs to in the complicated environment with Russia present in that region, that's also an important U.S. commitment. Whether it's in Gaza, Israel's ability to respond either in a preventive manner or in response to rocket attacks whenever they come up, and that right of defending itself respected by the world, by the international community, recognizing even threats that present themselves at the fence have to be managed and have to be dealt with, and Israel does it as professionally as it can. That's another commitment in a very tangible security challenging environment. And now we've seen in the last couple of weeks the same challenge facing the tunnels that Hezbollah is reaching. Points of unity around each of those security challenges. I'll even add Iran to that list, and I know that will sound a little bit strange because we know how, of course, there has been a divisive debate around Iran, around the nuclear deal over the last 3 or 4 years during the negotiations when Congress was reviewing it through the remaining months of the Obama administration and through the first 2 years of the Trump administration. But I want to share a dirty secret about the issue of Iran and the nuclear program in Iran. Supporters of the JCPOA and opponents of the JCPOA are absolutely in consensus, in agreement, and united around the principle that Iran must be prevented from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And that's a fundamental requirement. We're equally determined to do that. We both understand that Iran plays a terribly destabilizing regional role, obviously threatening Israel, but threatening many other countries and our own troops around the region, sponsoring terrorist organizations of all kinds, participating in the civil wars in Yemen and Syria, undermining the government of Iraq, and so forth. And so the question that was divided us was about means, not ends. The ends were very clear: preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon. Now, of course, the agreement that was signed was intended to be an agreement that, while not perfect, and I will acknowledge it was not perfect as a supporter of that agreement, did buy time, did push out Iran's ability to acquire a nuclear weapon by a significant number of years. And it wasn't perfect, but that was the ends, the means the previous administration sought to achieve that common end. The new administration has decided not to stick with that agreement. It is imposing real sanctions on Iran, new sanctions that are having a real bite. One can see that in the struggling Iranian economy. But, of course, in the environment of leaving the JCPOA with less of an international consensus, less of international support. And so that's the means they have chosen. So this is a debate on means and not ends. It doesn't mean that's not a meaningful debate, but the fundamental principle that we are united on is preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon which would turbocharge its ability to threaten Israel and spread its malign influence without the region. There's one other area in Iran where there's also consensus, and that is on the nature of the Iranian regime. Secretary Pompeo, about, I guess, 7 months ago or so, gave a speech in which he outlined 12 concerns or demands about the Iranian regime, and I can sign up to every one of them. And they very much echoed speeches that were given during the previous administration as well. This regime of Iran is a nuclear weapon-seeking, terrorist-sponsoring, human rights abusing, neighbor-threatening, destabilizing regime. The sooner it comes to an end, the better. The more we can support in appropriate ways the Iranian people as they express their opposition to the corruption and brutality of this regime, the better. So these are also points of consensus, whatever your position was on the JCPOA. And I'll just add to the surprising points of consensus or fundamental principles that do unite us around the Palestinian issue. Now, of course, there are disagreements and there are differences about how Israel and the Palestinians might resolve their conflict, whether they can resolve their conflict, what the end state should look like. I don't mean to minimize that in any way, shape, or form. But I do think there are, even within that sometimes disagreement, there are some also very important common principles. One is that, as every Israeli prime minister over the last 2 to 3 decades has come to understand and try to advance in their own way, the need for separation, the desire to have Israelis and Palestinians not part of each other's daily lives, not threatening one another, not occupying one another, preventing that kind of friction. The importance of the outcome ensuring Israel's viability and future as a secure Jewish democratic state. That is the essence of the Zionist vision, that a stable Jewish majority in a democratic society in the historic homeland of the Jewish people able to defend itself against all threats, and if possible, at peace with its neighbors. Those are unifying principles. Any violence, any glorification of violence, any encouragement of violence, any payments to those who have committed violence, such as has been targeted by the Taylor Force Act, are completely out of bounds and completely unacceptable, and there's bipartisan consensus on those points. Whatever one views as the appropriate approach to trying to advance the goal one seeks to choose. Mine is a two-state solution. There are certain tactics that are out of bounds. BDS, the boycott, the sanction, the divestment, the delegitimization of Israel in any measure is out of bounds and should be treated as such. And I don't care which party somebody is part of when they articulate that. We need to call them on it. And finally, and I'll just finish because I see Senator the leader has arrived. the importance of keeping alive that possibility of a future separation. Again, my card's on the table. I believe that's a two-state solution with Israel and Palestinians both able to live out their self-determination as neighbors and not compromising each other's future. That may take years. That may take decades. We know the current Palestinian leadership is not up to the task, but I hope we will work together with Israel, as has been the bipartisan commitment of all previous administrations, to keep that option and possibility alive so that the fundamental reality of Israel as a secure Jewish democratic state, our ally, who has been able to be such a great partner, will exist for time immemorial. And I'm very proud of the role that the Congress has played in a bipartisan way in reinforcing those fundamental principles, and I very much look forward to that also being the case in the next Congress. Thanks very much.
Thank you very, very, very much.